Family was the central concept for the society of Republican Rome. Its 500-year history can be viewed as a competition between different clans, or gentes. Well, the Republican period ended 2000 years ago, so it's about time we figured out who had actually won this contest. But first we need to set the rules. We would only be considering the time frame from the expulsion of the Tarquins to the adoption of the title of Augustus by Octavian. After this, the playing field is too obviously skewed towards the members of the imperial family, and comparing imperial dynasties is the matter for another analysis. The total score of the gens is determined by tallying the offices that its members have acquired, no matter to which branch or stirp they belonged. I counted consulships, dictatorships, terms as a censor and as the tribune of the plebs, and all of the other magistracies. By calculating a weighted sum of all those, we get the final score for every noble clan. The best way to assign weights to different offices is debatable. The weights roughly reflect the influence and the term length of the office, but those differ significantly throughout history, so keep this in mind. In total, I counted 808 gentes. 262 of those had at least one member who held an elected office during the Republican period. I initially wanted to do a top 10 list, but around the 10th place there are several families whose scores are very close to each other, and their exact order is easily influenced by adjusting the weights. So instead, I'll be listing every one of the 16 gentes that scored above 200, and will separate them into two tiers. This first part would be about those who placed from 16 to 6, and in the next one, we'll talk in greater detail about the top 5 gentes. Gens Marcia has a unique distinction of having been influential during the Roman Kingdom period. It had among its members the fourth king of Rome, Ancus Marcius. The early Republican history gave us Gaius Marcius Coriolanus, the anti-hero of Shakespeare's tragedy. The later history is defined by their plebeian branches. Marcii Rutili produced the first plebeian dictator, Marcii Regis the first plebeian Rex Sacrorum, and Marcii Philippi scored the most in the consulship category. Their influence in the late Republic, however, was nowhere near what they had in its early decades, so they barely made it onto this list. The history of Sempronia is similar to that of gens Marcia. They are a very ancient patrician family, which had some prominence in the early decades of the Republic, but the lion's share of their fame came later from their plebeian branches. After scoring multiple consulships in the 5th century, Sempronia fell into relative obscurity in the 4th. They only resurfaced towards the middle of the 3rd century, and by then all their prominent stirpes are plebeian. Sempronia Sophii, Sempronia Longi, and the others did score some major offices during the Samnite and the Punic Wars, but the real 15 minutes of fame of gens Sempronia came with the Gracchi. The Gracchi brothers were the most influential tribunes of the plebs in the history of this office. Their political careers began a whole new period in the Republic's history. The overall standing of gens Sempronia may not seem that impressive, but taking into account the fact that it's been a dominantly plebeian gens for most of its history, it looks much more respectable. Not far from gens Sempronia, we have gens Iulia. Despite having the most famous of all Romans in their ranks, Iulii didn't make it into the top 10. They may have traced their lineage back to Aeneas, but didn't have much to show for it until the time the famous dictator came into the scene. After several consulships in the first decades of the Republic, prominent Iulii are virtually impossible to find in the following centuries. I suppose they were saving energy to burst back on the scene in the 2nd century. From that point on, Iulii Caesarion once again started scoring consulships for the team, and of course the man himself made sure that the name of Iulii will be forever remembered. But we are ranking the performance of the whole gens across multiple centuries, and even Caesar himself can't make up for the multiple centuries of obscurity, so as a whole, Iulii barely make it onto this list. This family may not have cracked the top 10, but its placement is one of the most impressive. This is because gens Licinia is the only originally plebeian gens on this list. Sempronia may have redefined the office of the tribunus plebis, but the Licini were the champions of the plebeian rights from the very beginning. One of the two first tribunes of the plebs was Gaius Licinius. The first plebeian magister equitum was Publius Licinius Calvus Esquilinus. And of course, the first plebeian consul was Gaius Licinius Calvus Stolo. However, none of these distinguished statesmen were quite as famous as the Mr. Moneybags himself, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Licinii Crassi were decently rich at the beginning of the 1st century BC, but almost all of their wealth was confiscated in the Marian proscriptions. Crassus had to rebuild the family fortunes from almost nothing. His success is another demonstration of the tenacity with which gens Licinia fought for their place in the sun. So even though Licini may have been looked down upon by their patrician compatriots, they produced a record amount of the tribunes and remained relevant until the end of the Republic and beyond. At number 12 we have gens Postumia. Postumii earned illustrious fame during the Republic's earliest days. They were very prominent in both political and military affairs of the state. In 496 BC, Aulus Postumius Albus was appointed a dictator and defeated the Latin League near Lake Regillus. This victory is one of the most important in early Roman history, because it put an end to the attempts to restore the monarchy by Rome's ousted king Tarquinius Superbus. Shortly after, two members of Postumia helped to resolve the Republic's first major political crisis. Both the aforementioned Albus and Publius Postumius Tubertus were members of the delegation that negotiated with the plebes and found a compromise that stopped their very first secession. In the later centuries, the overall prestige of Postumii waned. Only one prominent branch, Postumii Albi, retained their influence, and even they were receiving way fewer consulships than before. The fame of the gens Quinctia is based on two big names. The first one is the legendary Lucius Quinctius Cincinatus, or Cincinnatus, the paragon of republican virtue and the role model of the American founding fathers. His example of incorruptibility in no small part helped the republican system survive as long as it did. The second is the liberator of Greece, Titus Quinctius Flamininus. Flamininus was first elected consul in 199 BC, before reaching the age of 30. He defeated King Philip V and delivered the Greek city-states from Macedonian dominance. Polybius' description of his announcement at the Isthmian Games is one of the most memorable scenes in all of classical history. Unfortunately for the overall standing of the Quinctii, other members of the gens did not come close to replicating the glory of these two. It was enough to earn them a spot in the top 15, but not much higher. Papiria is another gens of the early republican prestige. Papiri first came into prominence through the religious institutions. The first Rex Sacrorum and the Pontifex Maximus were the members of the gens. The biggest name of Papiri came 1.5 centuries later, once again during the Samnite Wars. Lucius Papirius Cursor was a 5 times consul and twice dictator, who avenged the Roman humiliation at Caudine Forks and reduced the Samnites to the shadow of their former power. His son and full namesake finished the job in the Third Samnite War. Livy especially heaps praise on the elder Papirius Cursor, saying that if Alexander the Great marched his army west instead of east, he would have met his match in the Roman dictator. Papirii Cursores disappear from the public eye in the later centuries, and most of the patrician branches of the gens followed suit. But the plebeian branch, Papirii Carbones, took the mantle of the clan's champions. Because of their numerous tenures as tribunes of the plebs, gens Papiria finds itself in the top 10 most influential families of the Republic. Gens Sulpicia had a long history of service to the Republic, but no real superstar names among them. The fact that the most famous person in their whole history was Emperor Servius Sulpicius Galba, who reigned for a grand total of 6 months, kinda says it all. but they still had some notable moments. What Sulpicia have going for them is the number of moderately prominent branches. Sulpicia Camerini, Sulpicia Longi, Sulpicia Petici and the others all contributed in some form towards the prestige of the gens. The height of the prominence of the Sulpicii was the 4th century BC. In the middle of this century, Gaius Sulpicius Peticus served as a consul 5 times and scored multiple victories against the Gauls and the Etruscans. Some 50 years later, his distant relative, Gaius Sulpicius Longus, triumphed over the Samnites at the Battle of Terracina, which helped turn the tide of the Great Samnite War. So even though their nomen isn't instantly recognized like some others on the list, Sulpicia certainly deserve their place among the most prominent families. Gens Furia is one of the few families on this list with a real superstar among their ranks. 6 times consul and 5 times dictator, Marcus Furius Camillus is a man with very few peers in the Republican period. 400 years before Augustus, he was honored as the second founder of Rome. Camillus achieved great things both as a military commander and as a politician. He celebrated triumph 4 times and helped the resolution of the conflict of the orders in 367 BC. With the figure of his stature, gens Furia may have placed even higher, but they lack a long-lasting prominent branch. They had a lot of moderately prestigious offshoots that together raked up a respectable amount of consulships, but none of them were consistently in the forefront of Roman politics. Another clan of the early Republican fame is gens Manlia. Just like those of Sulpicii, their most famous members are from the 4th century BC. First is Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the hero of Rome, who later became its villain. He saved the Roman capital from capture during the Gallic sack, but 5 years later was executed for the attempt to become the king. Another prominent Manlius is also a character in the tale of Republican ethics. Titus Manlius Imperiosus Torquatus was thrice a consul and thrice a dictator. He earned his fame during the war against the Latin League, both as a successful general and as a strict disciplinarian. To ensure the discipline of his troops, Manlius Torquatus had to execute his own son for disobeying the orders. His legacy defined the character of his descendants. Manlii Torquatii were the most distinguished branch of the gens, often lauded for their bravery and loyalty to the Republic. However, they were also the only Manlii branch which remained prominent in the later centuries, which explains why their gens is not higher on this list. Servilia may seem the most surprising placement on the list, but if you look at the way they achieved their score, it starts to make sense. In every period of Republican history, Servilia had at least one branch which carried the rest of the team. In the 5th century, these were Servilii Prisci. In the 4th, this mantle was taken by Servilii Achalae. The 3rd century saw the rise of Servilii Gemini and Servilii Caepiones. Both distinguished themselves during the Punic Wars, and the latter continued their prominence until the very end of the Republic. Servilii are also unique in that their most famous offspring is a woman. Servilia, the mistress of Caesar and the mother of Brutus, didn't score any military victories or pass any laws, but is better known to the public than any of her relatives. It is also notable that her son, born Marcus Iunius Brutus, was later adopted by his maternal uncle and became Quintus Servilius Caepio Brutus, which legally made him a member of the gens. So these are all of the Tier 2 gentes. They all greatly contributed to the success of the Roman Republic, but their prominence wasn't consistent enough for a higher placement. There is a 78-point gap between Servilii and the 5th place, so splitting them into different tiers is well justified. I'm going to complete the list in the following video and talk about each of the gentes maiores in greater detail, so stay tuned. But for now, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.